because of American pressure on Israel.
Not Israel while visiting Israel.
And unacceptable to Israel, to the land of Israel.
I'm Rabbi Pesach Woolicki, and you're watching Eyes on Israel. Over the past few months, the Biden administration has become more and more open about their desire to remove Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In early March, the administration hosted Benny Gantz, Netanyahu's main rival, and they treated him like a head of state. He met with Kamala Harris, with senior State Department officials, and leaders in the Senate. Then, on March 14th, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer took to the floor of the Senate and blasted Israel. He called on Israel to go to new elections. That's right, he called for new elections in a different country. He sharply criticized Prime Minister Netanyahu and called him, quote, an obstacle to peace. Let's understand what's really happening here. Considering how inconceivable it is that Schumer would go off like this without the sign-off from the administration, Schumer's attacks on Israel should be taken as much more than a personal opinion. The speech was full of outdated foreign policy talking points and slanders against Israel worthy of an Ivy League Hamas rally. And it's worth listening to.
As a lifelong supporter of Israel, it has become clear to me the Netanyahu coalition no longer fits the needs of Israel after October 7th. The world has changed radically since then, and the Israeli people are being stifled right now by a governing vision that is stuck in the past. Nobody expects Prime Minister Netanyahu to do the things that must be done to break the cycle of violence, to preserve Israel's credibility on the world stage, and to work towards a two-state solution.
Listen up, Chuck. First of all, when it comes to the prosecution of the war on Hamas, Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing exactly what needs to be done to, quote, break the cycle of violence. You see, the cycle of violence you refer to actually goes like this. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and everyday Arabs in Gaza, Judea, and Samaria, known as the West Bank, attack Israeli civilians. They fire rockets at our towns, they murder Israelis in their homes, they kidnap Israelis, and torture them. Israel then fights back, then there's a ceasefire, then it all begins again. That's the cycle of violence. And the only way to stop this cycle of violence is to destroy the capability of the terrorists. As for Israel's credibility on the world stage, Chuck, that's not why we're fighting this war. Yes, it's nice to have friends, but frankly, we prefer victory over an existential threat to credibility on the world stage. And you're right, Chuck. Prime Minister Netanyahu cannot be expected to work towards a two-state solution. You know why? Because nobody wants a two-state solution. Recent polling shows that 3 in 4 Israelis are opposed to the creation of a Palestinian state. And just last month, 99 of 120 members of the Knesset voted to reject recent U.S. calls for a Palestinian state. So you're right, Chuck. Nobody expects Netanyahu to do these things. They don't want him to. And as for being stuck in the past, as you say, this entire speech was one long restatement of failed 1990s Mideast policy built on the wishful thinking that led to October 7th in the first place. The fantasy that a moderate Palestinian leadership exists is the definition of being stuck in the past. Hey, Chuck, the Clinton administration called. They want their foreign policy back.
If he were to disavow Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and kick them out of his governing coalition, that would be a real meaningful step forward. But regrettably, there's no reason to believe Prime Minister Netanyahu would do that. He won't disavow Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in their calls for Israelis to drive Palestinians out of Gaza and the West Bank. He won't commit to a military operation in Rafah that prioritizes protecting civilian life. He won't engage responsibly in discussions about a day-after plan for Gaza and a longer-term pathway to peace. Hamas and the Palestinians who support and tolerate their evil ways, radical right-wing Israelis in government and society, President Abbas, Prime Minister Netanyahu. These are the 4 obstacles to peace. The Palestinian people must reject Hamas and the extremism in their midst. Quite frankly, I haven't heard enough Palestinian leaders express anguish about Hamas and other extreme elements of Palestinian society. I implore them to speak up now, even when it may be hardest, because that is the only true way to honor the lives of all those lost, by transcending the enmity and bloodshed and working together in good faith for a better future. Once Hamas is deprived of power, the Palestinians will be much freer to choose a government they want and deserve.
Ooh, boy. So, first, Chuck tells Prime Minister Netanyahu which members of his government he should fire. Then he calls Netanyahu an obstacle to peace. That's rich. You know what's an obstacle to peace, Chuck? A Palestinian leadership that teaches its children that murdering and raping Jews is a sacred act. And Chuck, the reason why you haven't heard enough Palestinian leaders express anguish about Hamas is that you haven't heard any Palestinian leaders denounce Hamas, and that includes the leaders of the Palestinian Authority, who you somehow think is suitable to lead a state that would be at peace with Israel. Why would they denounce Hamas? The Palestinian Authority is currently working to form a unity government together with Hamas. And polling shows overwhelming support for Hamas among Palestinians. Polling from late December, over 2 months into this war, shows that 72% of Palestinians were in favor of the acts committed by Hamas on October 7th. Yes, all those atrocities. Let's remember that Hamas was elected overwhelmingly to govern Gaza and would win an election in Judea and Samaria, known as the West Bank, if an election were held today. The reason Chuck hasn't heard any Palestinian leaders denounce Hamas is that they are Hamas. And that comment about a plan for Rafah that prioritizes civilian life, is Chuck Schumer now just parroting Hamas talking points about excessive civilian deaths? To quote John Spencer, chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point, who served for 25 years as an infantry soldier and 2 tours in Iraq, quote, Israel has taken more measures to avoid needless civilian harm than virtually any other nation that's fought an urban war.
Israel has the right to choose its own leaders, and we should let the chips fall where they may. But the important thing is that Israelis are given a choice. There needs to be a fresh debate about the future of Israel after October 7th. In my opinion, that is best accomplished by holding an election. Prime Minister Netanyahu's current coalition remains in power after the war begins to wind down and continues to pursue dangerous and inflammatory policies that test existing U.S. standards for assistance. Then the United States will have no choice but to play a more active role in shaping Israeli policy by using our leverage to change the present course.
Got that, everyone? So point 1, Israel is a democracy. Point 2, I, Chuck Schumer, am going to stand on the floor of the United States Senate and demand that Israelis in a different country hold new elections, even though the overwhelming majority of Israelis do not want new elections while the war is ongoing. As for confidence in the Israeli government, it's true that many Israelis are unhappy with Prime Minister Netanyahu for a whole host of reasons, but I assure you, Chuck, it's not because he rejects the diktats of the Biden administration to accept a push for a Palestinian state. And Chuck, I promise you that Israelis are most definitely deeply engaged in a fresh debate about the future of Israel after October 7th. Thank you for your comments. Because among the important lessons about Israel's future is the realization by a fast-growing number of Israelis that we cannot continue to be so reliant on the United States, that we must become a more self-sufficient country so that the U.S. doesn't have this kind of leverage in our national security decisions. More and more Israelis are realizing that U.S. policy interests, as they relate to Israel, have unfortunately more and more to do with preserving the U.S. relationship with Iran and Qatar that the Biden administration is so dead set on being friends with, and less to do with Israel's needs as a U.S. ally. And Chuck, you know what the fresh debate about Israel increasingly does not include? Any discussion of a two-state solution.
Now, I know that there are many on both sides who question how we can discuss peace at a moment like this. So many Gazans are displaced from their homes and struggling to meet their most basic needs. Many are still burying and mourning their dead. Entire families have been wiped out.
Really, Chuck? Is there evidence for this? The published numbers of civilian casualties provided by the laughable Gazan Health Ministry, run by Hamas, of course, even if we take those numbers at face value, they produce a non-combatant to combatant ratio of 1.4 to 1. A ratio so low is unprecedented in urban warfare, leading military experts like John Spencer, who we just quoted, to praise Israel's unprecedented ability to protect civilians. But I'd really like to know the details of these entire families that Chuck Schumer says have been wiped out. Throughout Jewish history, during the centuries of exile under hostile regimes, there were always Jews in the community known as court Jews. These Jews would get close to the authorities, they would be granted special privileges, they often became the tax collectors for the Jewish community, and in many cases would end up doing the dirty work of the anti-Jewish authorities, aiding and abetting their onerous anti-Jewish policies. In Nazi Germany, they were called the Judenrat. In the Soviet Union, they were called the useful Jews or the pocket Jews. And in the United States of 2024, we call them Chuck Schumer. We'll be right back with more Eyes on Israel in just a moment.